Chapter 10, Alexander 9, August 2nd, 62,452,978 BC. On Twala, as on earth, ocean life had crept onto the land. Plants and animals flourished in their times, and when the time came again, the road was paved anew for the next phase of life. For as much as he wanted to shelter all life, he found that extinction and revival seemed to be an evolutionary imperative. As conditions changed, the lifeforms had to adapt to the changes or die. He could foresee no benefit to nature by way of intervening on behalf of any one evolutionary chain. He had tried already and failed. He was watching everything, everywhere on Twala, harnessing the senses of all the life that he'd fostered, entranced, buried in the side of a mountain that had engulfed him hundreds of millions of years ago. Alexander was Twala, and Twala was Alexander. He arranged what he could for the benefit of life, using the telekinetic and telepathic waves that he could harness, but it always seemed to do more harm than good. It seemed that when he favored one species of animal over another, which he tended to do in the beginning, they would become too specialized from having been so long nestled in his care. Then, as inevitable crises occurred on Twala, such as climate changes, geological events, and other causes for disruptions in the food chain, not only were those under his care maladapted to the new conditions, but they were, from an evolutionary standpoint, unaccustomed to changing and adapting as a species, all because they were sheltered from afar by their unseen benefactor and allowed to become dependent on his gifts. So he did not interfere anymore. He just observed. The most recent mass extinction event on a global scale had happened 12 million years ago, when the collision of two giant landmasses blocked the path of the established trade winds and carved one ocean into two. Because the warm waters around the equator could no longer mix with the frigid waters of the southern pole, great storms began to become more and more violent because of the evaporating warmer waters. When the air mixture between the perpetually low and high pressure systems collided, it meant great cataclysm for the land creatures. A large portion of the Southern Ocean froze solid due to its waters having been so long trapped in the cold. The water content of the atmosphere trapped heat by way of its mass interacting with the heat of sunlight, forging an ever-increasing greenhouse effect, and the climate began to get warmer and warmer. Dead plant and animal material all over Twala also contributed to the cause by the release of carbon dioxide and methane during the process of decay. Over the last 12 million years, however, the excess gases were slowly encapsulated in the churning stone and waters of Twala, and she righted herself yet again. The land-dwelling creatures were small, but their offspring were getting larger, as they no longer had to compete for resources, and they were becoming more numerous again. Something new was also happening. Periodic glacial epochs would grip Twala in ice and then release it again in cycles that would last between 10,000 and 100,000 years. The day on Twala had slowed due to interaction with her moons and bulging of her mass along the equator, and a full day was now a little over 21 hours. She was comparable in size to Earth, and Twala's gravity was only slightly less than that of Earth. To complete a revolution around the Sun took 416 days. In most every respect, she was a sister to Earth. Even her life took on similar forms. As multicellular life became more and more complex, advanced defense mechanisms to safeguard their stored energy evolved in stride. When the eye evolved and the light was harnessed, it triggered an evolutionary arms race. For now, the prey could evade the oncoming predator, and the predator could actively seek its prey. From there, the game was afoot. In an attempt to become better equipped to survive, the once soft outer layers of many of the creature's bodies evolved to become rigid to protect the soft organs within. This worked well for protection, but inhibited growth, and this vein of creature would have to molt its skeleton periodically to allow for growth into and beyond maturity. It also made them heavy and cumbersome out of the water, which is why most segmented exoskeletal creatures to grace the land and take to the air were small. Another line of creature from the same evolutionary branch formed instead an endoskeleton. They sacrificed the protection of their organs for the ability to grow larger and swifter, and it made their senses more attuned to the vibrations of movement, and they developed sensory organs capable of interpreting information more adeptly than their arthropod cousins. They came to form a line of vertebrate animals, the same way as it had happened on Earth. In time, the vertebrates would dominate Twala with their immense sizes and variety of forms. At the time of his reckoning, this was Tuwala. It was a world full of creatures with such tenacity that their eventual fate of becoming extinct had time and time again been thwarted. It was a world of survivors, but only because they had been left to their own devices and had ensured their own survival, only because they were able to adapt to changes. Alexander no longer had mixed emotions about any perceived duty to aid the life forms here. He'd learned that they were better off if he only helped them in subtle ways from afar. He never carried them out of the fire, lest they never learned to flee from it. He was proud. They were recovering from the recent cataclysm, and one of the little creatures, a little furry one with a twitchy nose, was even skittering about at the foot of his mountain, not 30 feet away from him, beyond the rock face. He welcomed the company, even though the little animal was oblivious to his presence, and that's when he remembered again that he was real. He realized that the mouse-like creature was scurrying about in the search for food nearby him, and he suddenly made the connection between his consciousness and his body. He had forgotten where he was, and the mangy little Nescat, as Tuwala, paleontologists of the future, would call it, had made him remember. And he loved the Nescat, because its presence meant that finally he was not alone. Lyland 12.9, March 28, 2311 AD. Emma Carter had a heart condition, one that, even with the advanced diagnostic techniques available in the early 24th century, could not be identified. The electrical conductivity was fine, circulation to the myocardium, the heart muscles, was fine. There were no detectable blockages or blood clots. Everything was fine, and yet her heart died a little more every day. The necrosis of the myocardium was gradual, and no intervention seemed to help. Biopsy of the tissue revealed that the normal culprit of cell death, inadequate perfusion or poor oxygen delivery, was not to blame either. Her cardiovascular and pulmonary systems were working perfectly. Her heart was simply dying at a faster rate than the rest of her body, as if it were aging faster somehow. Organ function of her heart was decreasing more rapidly, unnaturally fast, at nearly twice the rate of the natural degradation of her other organs. The only solution available to her would have been a heart transplant. She had been diagnosed in her 30s. She was now only in her 50s. Life expectancy of healthy people in 2311 was around 110, with some living well into their 150s and 160s. She was told that she wouldn't make it past 80 or 90 if she refused to accept the cloned donor heart, but Emma Carter was everyone and herself besides. She feared the scalpel, because she understood that even with the advent of superior surgical techniques, mistakes and accidents happen. Even the steadiest hand is prone to the occasional mishap. Not only that, but she also feared the fluidity of the future around her. She knew that even if she were to foresee that 99 times out of 100 the surgery would be a success, even if she were to review the various outcomes of the possible futures ahead of time and foresee no issues, there was always a chance that things may alter from their course. There are no guaranteed successes close to a source of divination that seeks them. Her very presence alters the future wherever she goes. It is what is known to science as the observer effect. Only in her case, it happens on a grand scale. A system cannot be studied without being altered. The act of observation changes the observation. It seemed that wherever she was not, the events of the future 8 days in any distant location were always the same. The same events happened, the same conversations took place, the same confrontations took place, and so on. Unless, of course, she actively altered the fate of those in a distant location, such as she had done by notifying Daniel Dwyer about the then forthcoming volcanic eruption. But things were different the closer one came to the vessel itself. Her own fate was more pliable, and therefore events closer to her in proximity tended to have more and more varied possible outcomes the closer to her they were. She was the epicenter for changes to an otherwise static future. But just because she could alter the fate of humanity, it didn't mean that she was in complete control all of the time. Sometimes the events she set in motion would quickly backlash, and she had more regrets than successes when it came to her trying to use her power for the betterment of society. If only she could see beyond 8 days and a handful of hours into the future, then maybe she could have initiated real change. But even the fully waked Lyland had regret. All-knowing is far from all-powerful. So Emma refrained, at least for the time being, from accepting the new organ. She would keep her heart for now. Daniel Dwyer consented, provided she had in-home care, and she was assigned an overly friendly, happy-go-lucky nurse at first who Emma just wasn't having. Shortly after, Emma had arranged that her old friend Rosa instead be her live-in nurse, and the rest was history. That was over 20 years ago, and she was still going strong. She only needed to stop every here and there, just every once in a while. She often told Rosa that she'd chosen her over her own heart, which made Rosa feel mixed emotions. First, it felt good that Emma liked her enough to want to have her around, but she couldn't help but feel that maybe if she'd refused to be her nurse, Emma would have gone through with the transplant, she herself refusing to have any other nurse in and about her house. Emma could see the future. She could change the future, but she could not make Rosa stay. She had to stay of her own free will. In most versions of the future, she always stays, but for anyone close to the vessel of Lyalan, there is a high probability that their actions may impact the future for either good or bad, if not both, and they are subject to dramatic timeline alteration in their own lives simply from contact with the butterfly effect, the ripple in the static timeline which constantly exudes from Lyalan. 8 days is really not a long time at all, and Emma was haunted by her limitations, so often afraid to make changes for fear of their impact having negative repercussions. So, most of the time she just stayed home and watched the world from her window, the window of everyone else's eyes. And that had become her life, watching from her window all the greatness of the world that Daniel Dwyer had made for them. She watched him time and again intervene to prevent the suffering of even a slight insult to any of his people, even those who openly rejected him. He was their God, and they were his children. And he had gifted them peace by way of taking away their freedom to act in anger against themselves and one another. Even the domesticated animals the people kept were treated with great dignity, and not allowed to be mistreated. This world was paradise for all creatures, mankind included, and all it had cost the people of the earth was their freedom. Humanitarianism was the focus of the exhibit they came to next. The dismantling of the barbaric practices of meat, dairy, and egg production industries through a process then known as factory farming, and how he slowly bred the billions of captive, overgrown animals down until their populations were healthy and sustainable to a degree that their lives could be happy. No animal would suffer at the hands of man under his watchful eye ever again. Sport and game hunting were also disallowed, not that anyone could have hunted anymore anyway. He'd already destroyed all of the Earth's guns. He aided the suffering animals swiftly, as pain was one thing that Daniel would not tolerate, and so many defenseless animals were suffering, and Daniel Dwyer loved every one of them. By the year 2075, he had the situation under control. Enough viable, nutritious meat substitutes were available to the population to negate the consumption of meat altogether, so Daniel put a stop to it altogether. From then on, all foods were approved by Daniel Dwyer prior to consumption by the masses, and he thus forced them to eat only healthy, nutritious foods from then on. Rice production was reinvented and moved indoors so as to no longer pollute the atmosphere. The tons and tons of methane byproduct given off daily then collected, concentrated, and repurposed for energy consumption by clean-running machinery both within and without the operation. The production of rice had then been made not only to no longer pump out greenhouse gases and hasten the death of man, but it had become a self-sustaining ecosystem, engineering its waste byproduct into the source of its own energy requirements. Even the moisture condensers that were placed to recycle water usage ran on the methane derivative, all powered by the growth of the rice itself. The exhibit displayed many before and after images of bloated, mistreated animals stacked on top of one another in cages, and then the same breed of animal healthy and happy. Some of the images depicted holding pens where there were so many animals packed into the space that they scarcely had room to move. It was a very sad display, and it touched the hearts of nearly all who saw it. No one ate meat anymore, but if anyone did, just one look at the terrible conditions under which the harvested animals were made to live at the time would have been enough to turn anyone off from supporting the industry and make anyone consider vegetarianism. The pictures in the display did nothing to convey the true horror some of those poor creatures had to suffer. Children attended the museum, so some of the more gruesome practices of old were only referenced on the plaque in front of the display and not pictured. Many of the omissions not pictured in the exhibit included the work of medicinal researchers experimenting on animals and were particularly horrifying. Perhaps most importantly, though, Daniel had put a stop to the mistreatment of domesticated animals in human households, which had been a serious unspoken problem until he intervened. Unlike the humans, the animals could not ask for help, but they needn't ask anything of Daniel, and he would tolerate it no more.